Okay, well, I'm very glad to be here today. I'm here with Faisal Devji, who recently wrote The Waning Crescent, The Rise and Fall of Global Islam. So thanks for being here, Faisal.
Thank you for coming to speak to me.
So one of the countries that you return to over and over again in the book is Iran. And as we speak, Iran is at war. And I wanted to ask you a bit about that because the state continues to use the language of Islam as subject. But what your book gets at is the exhaustion of that concept as a political one. So could you tell us a bit about how that framework allows us to make a bit more sense of what's been going on in Iran in 2026?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and there's several things that can be said about it. One is that already in 1979, when the Islamic Republic came into being as a result of the revolution, Islamism was a waning concern. Islamism was founded in the aftermath of the First World War as an ideological movement, very frequently to set up an ideological state of the kind that Soviet Russia and its satellites represented, and later of the kind that the fascist states of Europe represented. You might even think of certain liberal states as ideological in nature. So this was the period of ideologies, political ideologies, and of ideological states and of ideological revolutions. And that is the context in which Islamism emerged and thrived. But by 1979, you already have the decline of the Soviet Union beginning, if not already at full spate. And you had the gradual exit of ideological states and revolutions from other parts of the world. So in some ways, the emergence of the Islamic Republic was a belated phenomenon. It happened just as the Sunni Islamists, who were mostly lay people, not clerics, were going off course in the sense that all their important theoreticians, like the Indian, later Pakistani Abul Ala Maududi, or the Egyptian Sayyid Qutb, had come and gone already, and they were not producing new thought of any appreciably interesting kind. That is when the clerical classes in certain parts of the world decided to jump on that bandwagon, which was already rolling out of sight. And the two important groups were, of course, the Taliban in Afghanistan and the clerical establishment in Iran, the only ones that actually took power. So the great irony of Islamism as an ideological phenomenon is that even though it was pioneered largely by Sunni lay people and journalists in other parts of the world, came to constitute political orders in one Shia and one Sunni country, but among clerics. And Islamism served as a way for the clerical classes to really speak more broadly than to the much smaller constituencies they had spoken to before, insofar as they were lawyers. Their task was to define what law meant for people, and that task is always highly specific and particular. So it deals with specific cases. Whereas Islamism allowed them a much broader reach and a way of thinking about politics beyond the law, beyond Sharia. All of which is to say that the Islamic Republic of Iran, though it's often seen as a harbinger of Islamism, was actually a follower. It came late onto the scene, and it is departing late or belatedly from the scene.
Could we just pause a bit on the Shia dimension, because you mentioned that one of the phenomenon that we can observe just in the past few weeks is our specific demonstrations in many parts of the world in relation to defending Iran as a Shia state, from India to Nigeria, etc. How does that specific set of mobilizations speak to this question of whether we are before or after a certain eclipse of Islamism?
Well, it's not clear to me whether these demonstrations, and the most lively ones have been in South Asia, in Pakistan and India, are necessarily Islamist in nature. So the people who are demonstrating are not themselves part of Islamist parties necessarily. And in a way, their demonstrations, for me, are very interesting because we didn't see anything like them during the Gaza war among Muslims in South Asia, for instance. And I suspect the difference has to do not with sectarian differences, but with the fact that the war in Iran is seen as being a political conflict. That is to say, there is someone to support, there is a state to support, there is a government to support, there is a real opposition. Unlike the Gaza protests, which are largely humanitarian in nature. So, there was no one really to support. No one either was willing to or wanted to support Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority was not even in the picture. Neither of these two movements had made any appreciable approach to Muslims in Asia and Africa, for instance. And so they didn't really enjoy much in the way of support. Hamas also, as a classical Islamist party, was no longer part of a broad movement that was expanding. Iran is a very different story. Iran supporters, in this case, seem to have been largely Shia. But there is also a great deal of sympathy for the cause of Iran in these countries, more generally, which has nothing to do with religious or sectarian identity. So whether it is in India or in Pakistan, they are geopolitical, they are ideological in the political sense rather than the religious one, views for which Iran is a bulwark or a former or recent ally or an example of a global south country that is being attacked, etc., etc., etc. So the Shia protests occur in that context. That is not true for any of the, as I said, there are very few pro-Palestinian protests in the Gaza war, which precipitated the war on Iran. So I think that's the interesting comparison when you look at the protests today for Iran. They are protests for Iran. They often hold up, protesters hold up portraits of Khamenei, who of course was the supreme leader, and who did certainly have support among various sections of the Shia communities in South Asia as elsewhere. But again, it's not clear to me whether any of those people were partisans of the Islamist project itself, and they were certainly not Iranian, so they were never part of it in that particular sense either.
You had mentioned earlier that insofar as there was solidarity during the Gaza war, it was on humanitarian grounds among Muslims in different parts of the world. What does that specific fact say about Islam as a political concept in line with your book?
Well, first, just to reiterate that there were very few protests of any appreciable gravity or extent in the Muslim world as elsewhere in the global south, and that is something that has actually puzzled me. Why is it that the protests have mostly been in Western Europe and in North America? Well, in part, of course, because these protests have been demonstrating against the complicity of these countries in the war. But of course, a number of other countries, including other countries in the Middle East, have been complicit, if not more so, in the war in Gaza, for instance. There people may not have had the liberty or luxury to demonstrate, but you can't make that kind of argument for everyone in the whole world, from Turkey to Indonesia. And I suspect it's because these humanitarian causes have not generally found favor in these parts of the world. It's political causes that are actually important, if they are not particularly religious ones. So, protests over alleged insults to the Prophet, for instance, have swept much of the Muslim world at different occasions, starting with 1989 with the Rushdie protests. And there have been 2 or 3, maybe 4 since then. So they are not regular in occurrence, and they are transient and temporary in character. But they do occur. Then you have the protests of the Arab Spring, which have nothing to do with religion. But Gaza, very few, if any, protests. And as I said, I think this has to do with the fact that they were not seen as possessing a sufficiently political character. It was not clear who to support, why, so that the Palestinians could be understood as being like the Rohingya or the Uyghur. You might sympathize with them, they are historical bonds of solidarity, but there's not much more to do if the model of protest is set in the West and is about international law and all of these things, which are rarely in evidence or applied to other parts of the world. So, what are you defending if you don't actually see these provisions of international law in your own lives and in your own countries? It's difficult to defend them when they don't exist for you in any important way. So I think that's the big, that's the big story there, which is why you see the difference between these two events, even though they are linked in all kinds of ways. Now, with the Gaza attacks, of course, Hamas is also an Islamist party, but you see, even with them, the shift from religious to humanitarian language. They relied upon the international exposure of the victimization of Palestinian civilians and the grave crimes against humanity and other kinds of crimes that were committed in the war on Gaza. So there too you see a kind of, if not an exit from Islamic or religious language, at least an opening up to a more generic humanitarian vocabulary. That's not true in Iran, at least not yet. And I don't think it's likely to be true because the government is still in place and it has an established vocabulary. But again, just to point out that some of the themes, maybe even some of the most important ones, deployed by the Iranians are actually generic and not Islamist specifically. So, for instance, Khamenei's, in effect, martyrdom insofar as he refused to go into a bunker, refused to leave his house. He supposedly went about his life as if things were fine and normal, and therefore displayed a kind of fearlessness that made him a martyr when he happened to have been killed in the opening salvos of the war. So that kind of sacrifice, as others have said in the press, really, in some sense, and perhaps this was intended, redeemed him from his own disastrous career, as it turned out. And that kind of redemption, preceded by that kind of sacrifice, is something that can speak more broadly and widely to Shia supporters or others around the world. So yes, it's part of a vocabulary that has been finely honed by the Islamic Revolution, but that cannot really belong to it alone.
You bring up this distinction between what's generic and what's Islamist, and it brings to mind not only the case of Iran, but other parts of the world. I mean, you'd mentioned Indonesia, Turkey. These are places where there is Islamist rhetoric, but it's difficult to know what the content of that rhetoric is. And so the question I want to pose now is I think runs through your work, which is how to distinguish between whether a concept like Islam has ongoing vitality or whether it's kind of in this ongoing slush of being recycled. So on those kinds of examples, how do you distinguish between kind of what's being recycled but is really exhausted and what has ongoing vitality?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I suppose I should say, just to briefly set the context, that the book that you mentioned is about the way in which Islam comes to be imagined as a subject in history and of history. It can do things, it can have ideals, it can have a spirit, it can want you to do things. It becomes the real subject. And in that sense, it's a very familiar kind of subject, because this is what civilizations are often meant to do, and later on, it's what ideologies are meant to do. And so the point about Muslim history, like every history, is that it occurs within a regional, worldly, or global context even, and doesn't have a separate existence of its own. So as I was saying, for Islamism, its context was the making and breaking of ideological states, particularly during the Cold War. And it couldn't just survive that context to be an atavism. It changed in various ways. But it's not the only one. So before Islamism, you have, if you will, Muslim modernism or liberalism, which emerged basically in the colonial period, at the time when most Muslim countries were under colonial rule. And the problem that faced Muslim thinkers is how to, if not reconcile themselves with this rule, at least how to live in the world that it had created by engaging with the West, whether in terms of its power, its scientific prowess, its culture, its instruments of technology, etc., etc. So that form of Islam, understood as a civilization, came undone as a dominant mode of thinking about Islam by the time you move into the Cold War, when Islamism becomes the big way in which Islam is seen as a subject. And that too seems to be declining. Now, you still have modernists and Muslim liberals, of course, and you still have Islamists, so it's not like they cease to exist, but they are no longer the most important voices and no longer represent the most important movements in the Muslim world or in the world at large. And I'd always thought, beginning with 2001, as illustrated with 9/11, that the emergence of these militant radical groups, Al-Qaeda and then ISIS, really signaled the end of Islamism as a major project, because they emerged in opposition to Islamism. They didn't have the same kind of ideologies. They didn't necessarily want the same kind of ideological states. They weren't obsessed with imitating the Bolshevik Party as their model for an ideological party, or necessarily wanting an Islamic revolution of the communist kind, or whether in Russia or in China. And that's where the idea of the Islamic revolution comes in. And the Islamic revolution in Iran basically positioned itself between the East and the West. It looked at the revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution at the one hand, and then looked at Western imperialism on the other, and situated itself in the middle, both geographically but also in some ways ideologically. And this was not true for Al-Qaeda and later ISIS. So, we have, if you're looking at, different movements and their organizational forms, here we have at least three, and these are just three big ones. The militant movements, of course, were a blip in the sense that they came and went more or less within 10 years. But they really signaled a transition from one, if you will, kind of phase to another. What the phases that they transitioned into, it's not easy to tell. But you can see that Islamist parties either have to reinvent themselves, as in Turkey, since you mentioned Turkey, or in Tunisia with Ennahda. The Tunisian reinvention has not worked, at least not politically. The Turkish reinvention did not work in the Arab Spring when it was meant to have worked. And it's not clear what its future will be in Turkey itself, whether it will undergo more changes. elsewhere, Islamists are nowhere close to power. In Bangladesh recently, of course, you had the fall of the Bangladeshi government, and everyone thought that the Islamists, the Jamaat-e-Islami, one of the oldest Islamist parties, had a chance at power. And indeed, it looked like it was very popular. But when you had the elections recently, it's nowhere. So, it basically holds power in a very thin band of constituencies along the Indian border. That's it. Not accidentally. It's basically on both sides of the border you have a similar kind of thing happening, because on the Indian side of the Indo-Bangladeshi border you also have the Hindu Nationalist Party often in power in those particular constituencies. So that's part of a regional dimension of this politics. But the important thing to note is that even where they have survived, they don't really have a road to power open to them. Meanwhile, Pakistan already in the 1980s with Zia-ul Haq, had taken the language of Islam and of Islamism and basically subordinated it to military rule. But it's not the Islamist parties that ran the show, and it's not the Islamist thinkers that defined what was to happen. It was the military, and it still is the military. And they can recycle movements and go from one to the other. So that's another way in which Islamism gets redefined. Power? Nowhere. Somalia, out of the game. The Sahel and other bits of Africa, you still have these pseudo Al-Qaeda type militants. Afghanistan too, the Taliban have a problem with pseudo ISIS type militants. Not particularly existential problem at the moment. The big problem, of course, is Pakistan. And in Pakistan similarly. So you really have seen an astonishing decline in their influence and power. And of course, Islamists have not been the same everywhere. In many places, they had represented some form of democracy and republicanism. So they were seen as a threat by monarchies, Gulf monarchies in particular, and they're still seen as a threat, even though that threat is now a kind of it's not a real, it's a kind of phantasmatic threat that you keep invoking the Muslim Brotherhood even though there's no sign that they have any influence or power. So their decline in some ways has meant also the decline of a certain version of Republican rule, and if you will, representative rule, whether you like what they represented or not. So, this is the situation in which we find ourselves where, Afghanistan, who knows what's going to happen, and they are struggling to define how their rule is to be understood. Iran, the government looks like it's surviving for the moment, but, its institutional survival does not mean its ideological survival. And it would be interesting to see what comes next, what happens. Whether it becomes even more Islamically defined and repressive, or whether it changes. In the last number of years, in response to Iranian protests, many of which have been put down brutally, as you know, there have nevertheless been changes. So, after the Masa Amini protests, it looks like in many parts of the country, enforcement of women's dress codes is not, being demanded by the state. So they won't necessarily change the law, but they won't enforce it. So there is a degree of responsiveness to some things and not to other things. And what happens at the end of this war is, of course, not clear. But the war is not really a war against Islamism. It's a war against a government, and it could have been any kind of government. After all, in this larger scheme of things, Iran and Venezuela, are in the same boat. Right. So or Cuba. So to understand the attacks on these governments as being purely ideological nature is really not correct.
in the book, the fate of Islamism sits within a broader discussion about politics and religion and how they are related or not related. And there seems to be a underlying frustration, if I may put it that way, about how we've really gotten that relationship wrong in how mainstream accounts of Islam have portrayed the relationship. I think 2001 is probably a milestone both in these mainstream accounts and in your own thinking. It's been 25 years. Looking back on the past quarter century of how we've misconstrued this relationship, can you identify why this relationship has been so confused and misleading in how the outside world has understood politics and religion?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the easy answer, which is too easy and therefore not persuasive, is to say that this way of thinking about Muslim societies as ones in which the religious and the political are intertwined in such a way as to make them repressive and to prevent them from liberalizing themselves, for instance, and advancing knowledge, but also freedoms for individuals. That this narrative goes back to the 19th century, if not earlier, and is, as many scholars put it, part of an Orientalist framing of the Muslim Middle East in particular, but also other parts of the world, and that it is a way of thinking that is very convenient for imperial powers and those that succeed them. Well, the dating might be correct, but I really am no believer in these stories of narrative continuity in which everything remains the same, even though everything manifestly also changes. So, in one sense, of course, I think the Muslim world serves, and it has served this purpose for a while now, as a mirror for the West in particular, where you can read your opposite into it. You can recognize yourself in some ways and refuse to recognize it in other ways. So, changes in Western Europe or North America get to be reflected in the ways in which Muslim countries, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere, are seen. But to have that view means that one has to have a bit more granular detail, and you can't just talk about religion and politics and their entwinement. So these much older categories have to be understood differently in the different periods they are deployed. So for instance, with so-called Islamophobic narratives today, you have this curious situation in which it is suddenly Europe in particular, Western Europe in particular, that is seen to be the heir to Muslim and other non-Western former colonies. Because now it is Western Europe that is understood as being in the pathway of a reverse colonization through migration and settler colonialism, with immigrants doing that, and Muslim immigrants in particular, right, providing the ideological language for such a takeover. So here you see a kind of one-to-one direct identification with the, if you will, the enemy, except you've changed places. So it's the very language that was used by Muslim and other non-Western peoples in the past, in colonial times. We have been taken over, our culture has been destroyed, we will never be able to recover ourselves, etc., etc., and the kind of existential dread. And it's one way in which decolonization and the period of globalization that followed the Cold War come to be reflected upon in the far right in the West. It's, if you will, the primary way in which the fact of decolonization and the making of post-colonial politics globally can be understood. So there too you will have this invocation of religion and politics, but again, it occurs in a very different context than it did, for instance, in the 19th century. It occurs in a context where it's the, if you will, Muslim or non-Western language that has been adopted wholesale by the, allegedly Islamophobic right. So that's one way in which you can deal with these apparently continuous narratives of religion and politics. Of course, the problem is that no one really can distinguish one from the other. It has been impossible to do so in the past and in the present. And that's very easy to see, whether it is invocations of God and religious language, especially in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well, whether it is the existence of established churches in many European countries, whether it is the presence, say, in this country of religious figures in the House of Lords, whether it is the names of places and towns, and you can't get rid of all that stuff which is religious, nor can you separate it out from the political. So there's a kind of anxiety about this relationship that is projected outwards, but that is actually also part of Western states and societies.
One of the important parts of the history here is how Islam is forged in an age of European empires, and that you follow that story through what you call the career of the concept of Islam. And that got me thinking of whether what you call the fall of global Islam or the end of it also is intimately bound up with what some people call the post-Western world today. But I wanted to pose that question to you because that might be too neat, of kind of whether this kind of post-Islamic world and this post-Western world go hand in hand, or whether you see something a bit different than that going on.
Well, that's interesting. The only way I would use the word post-Western is if it indicated the relative political and economic decline of countries we normally think of as being part of the West. And of course those may include countries like Japan or Australia, which are not in the geographical West. And more could be added to that list, Taiwan, etc. But in every other way, I wouldn't use that term, because the post-Western moment is also one in which no alternative that has claims to purity can emerge. So if you were to look, for instance, at the most anti-Western movements, like the militants who came and went in about 10 years of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, not only did a number, if not many, especially among ISIS recruits, many of them come from the West, and not only from Muslim communities, but from converts, but their ostensibly foreign and alien culture was completely mixed up with Western popular culture. Whether it was, playing games such as Assassin's Creed, or watching the Game of Thrones, or, when you look at the items that were smuggled into ISIS territory, it involved, these kinds of goods. So, American popular culture, especially in their sartorial self-presentations, this kind of ninja-like black garb with white trainers, for instance, in the things that they enjoyed, in their references. So you have a deliberately exoticized outward form, but completely intertwined with and mixed up with extremely familiar Western, mostly popular culture products, but also a familiarity with intellectual production. Bin Laden used to quote a number of people, including Samuel Huntington, whose theory of the clash of civilizations you of course bought. So it's impossible to make that separation any longer. In that sense, we are all part of a global world. And in a way, these Islamic militants were even more globalized than many others. So the desire for purity, whether it is in America or Europe through these movements which want remigration and the intensification and valorization of so-called Western values and civilization, or these Islamic mirror images of them, or anyone else for that matter. This is it is and will always be a failed enterprise. So you can certainly create oppositions of various kinds through practices, through viewpoints, through arguments, through sartorial and other styles. But none of that will actually disentangle any of these people from their own enemies. And in a way, that is the problem. So in that sense, I suppose I could say that you can use the word post-Western only insofar as it no longer defines and dominates, if it ever did, everything else. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't play a part in everything else.
Right. One of the ways that you kind of challenge the image of purity we have in a actually mixed up world is as you mentioned, through analyzing dress. And in one of the chapters that I found most surprising or revealing was the chapter on gender. And you describe this, at least to me, counterintuitive claim that women have become more representative of Islam than men according to certain movements. Can you just say a bit about what exactly you're observing there and what that tells us about the concept of Islam?
Yeah, well, in what's interesting is that already in the 19th century, by the middle of the 19th century, among these people I call Muslim modernists or liberals, in part because they're responding to Western critiques of gender relations in Muslim societies, they think they need to reform women, Muslim women. How do you do that? Well, you need to educate them, you need to make sure they're part of nuclear as opposed to extended families, that they become companions to their husbands, thus preventing them from going to enjoy the company of courtesans and dancing girls, etc., as had been the case for aristocrats in the past. To say nothing of same-sex relations, also very popular in the past. So women had to be made more like men, and they indeed become more like men. And what I find particularly fascinating in this process, which is otherwise quite generalized in different parts of the world, not least in Europe itself and North America, is that when women become more like men in these Muslim reform movements, they are not at the same time divided from men biologically. So very often the inclusion and education of women in the West was accompanied by a kind of more or less rigid ideology of biological separation and division. It's almost as if, where you try to equalize rights and liberties. So women attending Oxford, for instance, you had to mark the separation elsewhere. And that was often biology. And biology, of course, was crucial in other ways as well, because it also marked the distinction of race, both within Western societies and in their imperial outposts. So biology was absolutely crucial in thinking about how people relate to each other, whether it was gender relations or race relations, and I'm sure there are others as well. But in many of these Muslim societies, you have a deliberate effort to set aside biological distinctions, in part because they were recognized as being part of the playbook of colonial states. So the whole point of holding up Islam as a subject and as a universal category was to say that unlike the West, Muslims did not distinguish between racial types, and that if you were a Muslim, you were an equal of every other Muslim, whatever their ethnicity. Now, of course, this was not true in practice,
Yeah.
but it was true in theory.
Mm.
And it's remarkable how many Muslim thinkers latched onto this. Now, if you're going to criticize biological forms of hierarchy in terms of race and ethnicity, you're hardly going to reinstitute them in terms of gender. It becomes more difficult to do so.
Mm.
And so it leaves the relationship of men and women far more ambiguous.
I just want to check if I understand what you're meaning by theory and practice. So there's this kind of diagnosis that these categories are coming from the colonial masters, and there's a resistance to replicating them. I guess I want to know when these changed people's lives and when they didn't. So could you talk me through when a case in which it did change how gender might have been lived, and then ways in which they remained at a purely kind of abstract level of kind of recognition?
Well, the way in which changes happen, of course, are, especially among the liberals, easy to see, because literacy, education, family life, professional identities and the ability to work, and all the results of these kinds of changes. That didn't necessarily mean that these women are suddenly freer than they might have been. So, there's often resistance to these changes. Because, of course, among them is the fact that women are now, having become more like men, are meant to be just as religious. And they might not have been expected to be particularly religious in the past. So, a whole realm of feminine autonomy, different religious practices, different folkloric beliefs, women's societies in these extended households, games, friendships. In some parts of India, for instance, there were even specific ways in which women spoke the language of women that men didn't speak. So you have autonomous forms of gendered belonging and culture. And those are destroyed alongside the disabilities of women's subordination, let's say. And in becoming part of men's worlds, they also lose autonomy in other respects. And often they are meant to actually perform labor in these new, in these new nuclear families, where they're meant to manage their households with thrift. They're meant to learn enough arithmetic to do their household accounts themselves. They're meant not to rely on servants. They're meant to stay at home, not go out, and not hang out with other women. So that in some ways their lives are much more constrained, even though they are reading and writing and doing all of this stuff. So it's not an untypical story. So the changes are certainly ambiguous, and you can weigh and measure them and see whether they're positive in some respects and negative in others. But the refusal to make a biological distinction leads to very, very interesting consequences in which you have to mark gender differently. And for the Islamists in particular, this means sartorial and spatial segregation, in part because you can't rely upon biological difference. So it's the exterior that becomes more and more important rather than the interior. And that also means that the Muslim identity becomes externalized in some ways. So women in particular are identifiable externally, by the way they dress, by who they can interact with, but in the privacy of their own homes, they can be, depending on the volition of their husbands or fathers, as westernized, to use that word, as they like. They can wear whatever they want. They can watch whatever they like on television. They, again, depending on the views of the men who control those spaces. But nevertheless, so you have this very interesting reversal, whereas you normally think that is, whether in the diaspora, in the West, or indeed in colonial societies themselves, that individuals, men or women, have to be westernized on the outside, but they can be, as it were, non-Western on the inside in their private lives. Here it's the opposite, where you have to be Islamic on the outside, but in your private life, many more things are open to you, even though there are constraints in both arenas, of course. And it's the fragility of the distinction that is so externalized that I find fascinating. And that's why, I have a whole set of sections in that chapter you mentioned on intersex individuals, on how the language, the traditional classical language of the hermaphrodite, of hermaphroditism, and what happens to hermaphrodites, which presumes that there is not a binary gender distinction, is translated into ways in which people think about gender fluid identities and transsexual identities. So Khomeini himself, as I point out, approved of gender reassignment surgery, and the Islamic Republic of Iran has set up a really extensive set of institutional procedures to manage it, so that, and this is the work of an Iranian American anthropologist, so that there's a whole battery of psychiatrists and surgeons and therapists and who work with people who wish to transition, all of which is paid for and approved by the Islamic State. So you don't have binary gender identities really in many parts of the Muslim world, and in other parts you can actually switch.
I mean that's one of the most striking examples I found in the book. If we are witnessing the end of global Islam, as you argue in the book, what do you think that will mean specifically for this fragile line, this non-biological line between genders?
I don't see that changing much, actually. So what it might mean is that if we do see a decline of Islamism, that it won't be certain kinds of sartorial differences and restrictions that define gender identity. And you might not need to define it as such. So in India and Pakistan, for instance, where you have well-established third gender regimes, third gender recognized by law, and often have certain privileges that other classes of people don't. This is a tradition that goes back many, many centuries, but it's been recognized, including in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, the world's first Islamic Republic. People can speak about men and women, but the presence in public of third sex people, who are often people born men or intersex and who often dress as women, means that you can never really fulsomely depend upon gender binary distinctions, neither in public and popular practice nor indeed in law itself. And I don't see that changing much. It might even become more diversified. Not that intersex or third gender people are necessarily treated well or even equally, but they do have a status and a recognition in law. And also, of course, when I speak about the the end in quotes of Islam, its ending means not the end of religious belief or practice, but of Islam construed as a subject in and of history, of which, you know, I have pointed out three specific forms in the book: the modernists or liberals, the Islamists, and then the militants of the early 21st century.
So, as you point out, it's not the end of Islam in the maybe everyday sense we talk about it in terms of practice, piety, movements, but of a certain political concept. So if we take that to be the case, then I want to zoom back out again a little bit and just ask for, you know, it's 150, 200 years that this concept has reacted to an age of Western dominance and then moving into whatever we're moving into now. Is there a way to get a kind of overall post-mortem on it? What was it for? What was it? Was it basically the only path available, or was it really a detour from some other pathways in Muslim history, or is it too early to have that kind of post-mortem?
Well, it never got rid of everything else, you know. So one reason why I'm dealing with, if you will, modernists, Islamists, and militants is that I'm not dealing with Sufis and clerics. So apart from when the clerics become Islamists, as in Iran and in Afghanistan, and those categories of people still exist. It's not like they exist in some pure alternative form of culture and belief, but they are part of other kinds of logics as well. So it may be that they also use the term Islam in this way, but institutionally they've been constituted before Islam ever came onto the scene. And so they have a history that starts before it and that likely will go on beyond it. But I suppose what I would say to your larger question is that, you know, it's a familiar thing that happened to Islam. It happens to most, if not all, religious traditions. You can speak about Hinduism and Buddhism and indeed Christianity in the same way, you know. But of course, all these traditions or religions get to become abstract agents that are both different and alike. They have different trajectories, though they might start out from a similar place, intellectually speaking. And in the case of Islam, I think it was a kind of hugely ambitious project. That Islam was there to represent the human race itself, without distinctions and divisions, without any racialized hierarchies. And that it was the most natural of religions, and it, you know, should and would become the religion of everyone, and even if it didn't, it would still represent them in some way. So it really was a truly global way of thinking about Islam that depended upon sociology, and so was very modern. So it depended upon cartography and demography, where you could count people up and disperse them in parts of the world and have something called a Muslim world, about which the historian Jamil Aydin has written. But insofar as it was constructed as a subject, it also occurred in, and if you will, had its being in time. And that's what interests me. That this is not merely a spatial construct we're talking about, which would make it purely object-like, but it had a subjective dimension to it as well. It did things. And insofar as Islam became a subject in history, it had to have a beginning and a possible ending. The beginning was, very interestingly, not dependent on theological categories. But for many of these thinkers, including the Islamists, could be explained historically. Similarly, its ending need not be metaphysically understood in apocalyptic terms, but could be understood equally historically. And that meant that, if you will, Islam, was in some sense a metaphysical subject insofar as it was an abstract agent, but it was oddly not a theological one. It had a life and a possible death, like all human subjects do. And it's precisely in order to prevent its death that Muslims were endowed with the responsibility to protect it. And so what you see with the emergence of Islam as a global subject, with this universal mission of representing the whole of the human race, is the diminution of theological categories and ways of reasoning and arguing within such an ambitious project. And that is what I find really quite fascinating. So on the one hand, there's a kind of banal, almost sociological dimension to Islam. You can now map it and count it.
Sure.
And on the other hand, there is this historical dimension to it, which, if not banal, is, let us say, profane. Though it might be metaphysically freighted in other ways, insofar as all such abstract subjects are. Whether it takes the place of God is another question that might be asked. And as you know in the book, I argue that when Islam becomes a subject of this kind, it really diminishes the old theological subjects of Muslim history. And those include God himself, but also Muhammad, his prophet. And that gives rise to many different kinds of problems.
I think that's a great place to conclude on with one more question, because you describe how Islam displaces other concepts that were cardinal for many Muslims. I want to bring that up to today. So if we are seeing the end of Islam in this form, what are the potential successors that people are putting on the table that you think are worth considering, even if we can't predict the future?
But I don't think there's any one global project any longer. And the project of Islam itself was global, but it had many different dimensions. So I mentioned three: the modernists, the Islamists, and the militants. But you do have the revival of, for instance, Sufism, or as it's often known in Western countries, Islamic mysticism. You do have other kinds of revivals happening, and other forms of Muslim practice which are not revivals at all. So if you look, as I do in the conclusion of this book, at all the most recent great mobilizations of Muslims, their participants might all be very devout Muslims, or many of them, but none of them take Islam as a subject, which is extraordinary. So neither the Arab Spring that I mentioned, nor any of these protests in Iran against the Iranian government, nor these sort of important protests in India a few years ago by Muslims, the first ever in about 30 years, and among the most important demographically speaking protests ever in Indian history, led by Muslim women against a law called the Citizenship Amendment Act, which they held discriminated against Muslims, nor with the fall of the Bangladeshi government. So, here you have a whole host of movements and demonstrations and protests by Muslims, any number of whom might have been as devout or as practicing as you like, but for whom Islam was not important as a subject. It was not invoked in their...
Are these disparate... Do you see them right now as disparate phenomena that we have to understand disparately, or are there new kinds of connective concepts that...
I think they're probably connected in some ways. For instance, many of them, if we leave aside the Indian ones for the moment, because they occurred within a Muslim minority population, but take the majority Muslim countries, even where they want to displace governments, And they did in places like Egypt and Tunisia, and they did most recently in Bangladesh. They have occurred without recourse to political parties and organizations of a traditional kind. And this has meant that they have often been unable to, even when victorious in unseating a government, unable to constitute a new kind of state. Whether they will in future, I don't know, but I find it very interesting. But this, of course, was true of the color revolution, so-called, in Eastern Europe and some parts of Central Asia as well. So there's a global phenomenon where the political party is no longer at the center of organization. How it is to be replaced, no one seems to know. And I don't think it's the inability to put together a political party that is the problem. Eventually in Bangladesh you do have it, but of course an old established political party comes to power in the elections in Bangladesh, as I said, not a new one. Nevertheless, I think you have a critique of more conventional politics, liberal and democratic, for which the political party is really crucially important. But you see in other parts of the world that are not praised to such mobilizations, the decline and hollowing out of political parties as well. I mean, the Republican Party in the US was hollowed out completely by Trump and his MAGA supporters, and its old Bush-Cheney elite was cleared out. The Democrats have not yet been cleared out like that, but they seem to be supine at the moment. Similarly in Britain, you have these, in the opinion polls, huge shifts where the traditional political parties are actually now under much smaller and more recently formed parties. In France, again, old parties thrashed and new parties formed that come to power. So you're seeing something quite interesting happen to the political party as a form, globally speaking. What you see happening, whether in the color revolutions of Europe and Central Asia or these mobilizations in the so-called Muslim world, is, if you will, another step forward in that. Because in these places, political parties have either never really been particularly important or have been seen as agents of oppression. And so there's an effort to think about popular politics almost without them. How that is to work out in governments which still seem to require political parties is, of course, the big question. But so I would basically say, returning to your question, that what's happening in Muslim societies is a subset of what's happening in other parts of the world, politically speaking. The language that defines the politics is also changing. So we have much more religious language now in the United States and even parts of Europe. Christian language, Jewish language in Israel, are they just matching up finally to the Muslim world? Or has the Muslim world moved on in another direction and there's been a kind of exchange of identities or of bodies? I don't know. Difficult to say.
Well, I think it's a really good place to end on, because such a core theme in the book is to question whether things that are deemed to be particular are as particular, whether they really are part of bigger currents. Thanks a lot for talking today, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.